In today's video, I'll be attempting to complete dispatch without failing a single call throughout all 8 episodes. If I do end up failing, which trust me, I fail a lot in this video, I will just restart the shift I failed on. Notice I said shift and not the entire run because if I was doing that, this video would not be coming out. I would still be doing it to this very day. But don't worry, even with that rule, there's still plenty of RNG that comes to screw me over throughout this run. Anyways, let's get into it. We start things off with episode 1, which is a very easy episode. It's essentially just a tutorial introducing how dispatching works, and it's pretty simple. A call will appear and it'll give you a description describing what skills are needed to pass the call. And then you just choose what heroes you want to send, and the better the skills of the heroes align with the skills needed for the call, the higher chance you have at completing the call. This episode also introduces the concept of special interactions with certain heroes that can guarantee the success of a call, which is something that will be insanely valuable for this run since it just limits RNG. But other than that, this was a very easy episode and I managed to complete it on my first try, which is something that is not going to happen a lot in this run. In the second episode, I got introduced to the Z Team, which will be the actual roster of heroes I'll be using to complete this challenge. The shift started off pretty good actually, and I made it halfway through without anything going wrong. And then it happened. I failed my first call of this challenge. And I think being a 70% chance and I failed just perfectly demonstrates the difficulty of this challenge. Because I can just send somebody that fits pretty well with the call and just end up failing to pure chance. And the game demonstrates this even further in my second attempt, where I just ended up failing the first call of the shift. And I think it's just really honing in the fact that the RNG of this challenge is going to be brutal. Luckily, there is a way I can combat that RNG by leveling up my heroes to increase their skills. I'll get into my strategy a bit later into this video, but trust me, I'm cooking up something. On my third attempt, I made it past the call I failed, and it turns out there was only 2 more calls left for this shift, so if I would have passed that 70% chance call on my first attempt, I probably could have completed the entire shift on my first try, but I guess it just wasn't in the cards. Eventually, I reached the scripted final call of the shift where Invisigal is sent to stop a robber at a donut shop, which doesn't go well. But since it's scripted, I won't count it as a failure, and neither does the game, as it says I have 12 successes and 0 fails. Episode 3, Shift 1. What a shit show this was. This shift immediately starts off by introducing a brand new mechanic, sabotaging, which essentially, at any point, randomly, when I send heroes out on calls, one of them may just sabotage the other and prevent them from making it to the call, which just greatly reduces my chance of completing that call. And it immediately shows that because I failed the first call of this shift due to a sabotage. And I quickly came to realize that no matter who I would send on the first call, somebody would always get sabotaged. Whenever a hero did get sabotaged, they would be put in like a skill check thing, and I would have to choose the right skill in order for them to escape. And luckily, every hero had an option that would always guarantee an escape, except for one, Malevola. No matter what option I chose, she would always be one skill point short of succeeding the skill check. At this point, I was stuck with 2 options. Either A, I could not use Malevola at all, so I wouldn't fail the skill check, but then I would be a hero short the entire shift. Or B, I could figure out a way to level her up early so that when she does get sabotaged, she could pass the skill check. And I went with that one, but given the fact that I had virtually no control over who makes it to the first call, I was just gonna have to brute force it, which is exactly what I did. After tons and tons of trial and error, I discovered a method that would get Malevola to level up early into the shift. It just really wasn't great. Essentially, I would click on Coop over and over again until Malevola would force herself into the call, and then I would just send them on it and hope that Malevola would sabotage Coop, which seemed to be about a 50-50 whether she would sabotage her or not. And then if she did do that, she'd make it to the call, and she'd have about a 47% chance of actually completing the call. And if she does do that, she would get enough XP to level up, and I could give her 1 point into Charisma so that she could pass her skill check. Now, if we do the math, if we crunch the numbers here, 0.5 times 0.47 gives us about a 23.5% chance of this actually happening. And keep in mind, every time I failed this, I would have to watch the same 3-minute cutscene before I could try my next attempt. And this took me so many tries, it got to the point where I had to just completely mute the game because I could not bear to hear these same voice lines over and over again.
Team members is in need of assistance.
Now, with the Malevolent problem solved, if you want to call that solved, I was still just losing my runs fairly early into the shift because the whole sabotaging mechanic was just absolutely destroying me. And I was really at a loss. I did not know what to do. It seemed no matter what I did, heroes were just getting sabotaged and I would just fail calls as a result. But luckily, I just kept trying and I eventually made two discoveries that just absolutely saved me from losing my mind this shift. The first being, it turns out that there are certain combination of heroes that when sent on a call together will not sabotage each other. So I just started sending those heroes together on calls, and lo and behold, I actually started succeeding. And that took me so long to discover. I also figured out a better version of my Malevolous strategy, where essentially, instead of clicking on Coop, I would just keep clicking on Flambe until Malevola would force herself into the call. And for some reason, Flambe would just always get sabotaged. That effectively doubled my chances from 23.5% to 47%. Still not great odds, but I mean, it's better than 23.5. Using these solutions, I was able to get even deeper into the call where I discovered yet another problem. And this one, there is no solution for. You see, about 2/3 into the shift, there's a scripted call, and no matter what, Sonar will make it to the call. I do not get to choose who goes on this call. And he is not a great fit for it, as there's a 43% chance that I just end up failing. And of course, the first time I make it to the call, I failed it and was forced to restart the entire shift. And you see, this was very demoralizing. The fact that there was just no way around it, there was just going to be a 43% chance of me failing, really annoyed me. And every time I had to do an attempt at this shift, in the back of my mind, I just knew I had no control over this, right? But eventually I did make it past it, and I actually almost completed the shift. And then I accidentally chose the wrong skill check for one of the sabotages and had to restart. But after like another hour of attempts, I did end up completing the shift without failing a single call. And just to give you an idea of how long this took me, I originally planned on keeping track of how many attempts each shift took me, and I was gonna like show it on screen or something. But this took me so long that I completely lost count, and I did not want to go through all the footage and manually count how many tries. But I can tell you this: I have over 3 hours of footage on this shift alone, and yeah, this shift was by far the worst one we encountered. But trust me, there are worse later in this video. The second shift of episode 3 is like the polar opposite of the last shift. This one was actually pretty easy, and there really isn't much for me to talk about. So I'm gonna use this as an opportunity to get into my leveling up strategy. You may remember I mentioned earlier that I'd get into it. So this is me delivering on what I said earlier. So essentially, each hero has a partner they can build synergy with, which essentially, I say essentially, I'm saying essentially a lot. Which, um, what's another word for essentially? We'll say is like. Which is like a probability boost is what it does. It boosts the probability of me succeeding a call, and each hero can build that with some other hero. So my strategy is to just level up these duos of heroes so that when I send them on calls together, they cover a wide range of the board. For example, Punch Up. Punch Up can build synergy with Coop. So my plan would be to level up Punch Up's strength, vitality, and charisma, and Coop's agility and intelligence, so that when they're on calls together, they cover a lot of the board and also get the synergy boost, is what we'll call it. And following my strategy, I was actually able to complete this episode on my first try. But there is one thing that I need to mention that happened in the shift. I unlocked a new power for Flambe called Supernova. And what it does is, once he completes 2 calls, he gets max strength, max agility, and his resting time is reduced to like a second. I mention that now because it becomes very important very soon. Now, I originally planned on like transitioning from this shift to the first decision that I need to make that affects this run by saying like, "Oh, the shift was so easy, but this decision I had to make after it is what made this episode so difficult." But really, this decision was really easy. I had to choose between cutting Coop or Sonar, and I'll tell you right now, we cut Sonar in like an instant. It was a no-brainer for me. And the reason I cut him is because he's too inconsistent. His skills switch every time he goes on a call, and I do not need more randomness on a run filled with randomness. And I'm sure you could probably make this run work with them, but I'm not the guy to find that out. But with cutting sonar, we ended off the episode and move our way on to episode 4, where it punches some holes in my strategy. The first shift of episode 4 starts off down a teammate, and the game really wants you to feel that loss by absolutely bombarding you with calls. My initial plan was just to stick to my strategy and just send out heroes that pair well together, which got me about halfway through the shift, but things got worse when Malevola also decided to drop out this shift, leaving me down 2 teammates. With Malevola gone, my first attempt did not last much longer, ending with me having 5 calls I needed to respond to and only 1 hero I could send out. And really at this point I had to accept that my strategy was not going to work this shift. Being down 2 heroes was not going to allow me to send pairs of heroes to every call. If I wanted to complete this shift, I was going to have to figure out the optimal heroes to use for each call. But that could take a lot of trial and error and, I don't know, maybe even hours of attempts. Well, it was actually like an hour of attempts. It really sucked. But we did figure out the strategy. One word. Flambe. You may remember earlier when I subtly hinted at Flambe's power being very important later in the shift. Well, now it's later. And it is very important. I think without it we would not have completed the shift. For those of you who don't remember, even though it was like 3 minutes ago, maybe lay off the TikTok, I got Supernova for Flambe, which gives him max strength and agility after completing 2 calls. And it just so happens that he can complete like the first 2 calls very quickly in the shift. In fact, he's a perfect fit for the first one, and he has like I think like a 70. I don't know, it might not be a 70. You'll see on the screen if I'm wrong. I probably am wrong. So I could get that power procced very early into the shift. And then after that, man, he's just bouncing from call to call to call. He must have answered like 6, maybe, I'm not going to say it. Probably like 6 calls. But it wasn't all Flambe, just mostly Flambe. The other heroes did have some perfect fits where they would almost always complete calls, which helped greatly getting through this shift. But even using that and Flambe's power, I was still just barely able to respond to those 5 calls. That's why I believe this shift would not have been possible to complete without the Supernova power for Flambe, and that is why he's the GOAT of this shift, dude. He is the MVP. But after those 5 calls, the shift really dials it back. A few more calls trickle in, but really, they're no issue. And with that, we complete the first shift of episode 4 and move on to shift number 2. Actually, I lied. Before we get into the next shift, I have to thank the sponsor of today's video. No, it's not a sponsor. It's just another decision that will impact the rest of our run. I must choose between Waterboy or Phenomaman. And I chose Phenomaman. This was probably an easier decision than Cooper's Sonar, because Phenomaman is essentially a second Flambe. He has like a 1 second rest time, he flies well his calls, and his stats are pretty good. The only downside is I can't level him up any further, but as I just stated, he already has pretty good stats. Now, what's supposed to be the normal drawback of Phenomaman is that after you fail a call, he becomes depressed and you can't use him for like 40 seconds. But with a run like this, that doesn't apply to us because I have to restart the shift anyways. So I essentially get all the upsides and none of the downsides. But what made picking Phenomaman almost mandatory for me is the fact that Waterboy's power is that he will force himself into calls if you do not use him enough. And we already saw how much of a shit show episode 3 was because heroes were forcing themselves into calls. I will not be dealing with that for the rest of the run. So sorry, Waterboy fans. Bro does not make it onto the team. But with that rant over, we can move on to the second shift of episode 4, for real this time. This shift felt like the game was apologizing to me for all the shit I've had to deal with up to this point. With Phenomaman on the team and Malevola back, my strategy actually started to work again. Oh, I have to stop an assassination? Send out Invisigal and Golem. Need someone charismatic? That's Prism. Charming and strong. Well, that's my guy Punch Up, of course. Until it's asking between racing or reading, which had nothing to do with charming so yeah, we failed that, but then I just hit Flambe next time and he passed it because he's the GOAT. But really, there isn't much to talk about this shift. It was pretty smooth sailing, but I knew in the back of my mind the game was cooking up something to screw me over with, which it did in episode 5, where I failed the first call of the shift, and then on my next attempt failed the very last call of the shift. But other than that bullshit, this shift wasn't that bad, and I was able to complete it on my 3rd try. But don't worry, the game rebalances the scales on the next shift. This shift starts off by introducing 3 new mechanics. The first are double XP calls, which do what they sound like they do. The next was a citywide blackout, which wasn't hard to deal with, but having to do the same hacks to turn the lights back on after failing, it just got kind of repetitive. And the third and worst thing this shift adds are stat restricted calls, where if I exceed the stat level for the call, I would just immediately fail it. These calls were insanely annoying because there's really just not that many people I could send on them. I mean, I had one that had a 40% chance of succeeding, and one with a whopping 29% chance 2/3 into the shift. Luckily, I was able to boost my 40% chance to a 51% chance by sending Flambe on a single call beforehand. But when it came to that 29% call, I really didn't have any way to improve my chances of passing it, which sucked, led to a lot of failures. But I did figure out a way to make it take less tries. Instead of waiting to do this 2/3 in the shift, it turns out with the blackout thing, I could choose to just turn on that part of the city first and get the call out of the way earlier. But I'll admit, it took me a while to think to do this. Another benefit of the blackouts were that there was no timer on doing the hack, so I could let my team fully rest before starting the next batch of calls. But with these discoveries and a lot of trial and error, I eventually made it through the shift, managing to reach max synergy with some of my heroes, which boosts their success rate by 15%, which is pretty good. We now move on to the first and only shift of episode 6. The hardest thing about this shift was that I wasn't recording the first time I completed it and I had to restart it. But not much to mention other than I did get max synergy for Punch Up and Coop. You'd expect an episode right before the finale to be fairly difficult, but really this episode is just as easy as episode 6. There's only 12 calls. There's no new mechanics added except for the fact it's raining, which does not change anything. I was even down a hero this shift, and Vizical's not in this shift, and I still managed to complete it on my second try. After finishing the shift, I was met with my third and final decision, and unlike the first two, this one was actually kinda hard. I had to choose whether or not I was gonna cut in Vizical from the Z team. Either choice would negatively affect episode 8. Cutting her would leave me down a teammate the entire shift, but keeping her would give everybody else on the team a stat debuff. I decided to keep Invisigal. We've seen what has happened when I've been down teammates in this run, and it never ends well. Plus, my strategy kind of relies on having a partner for each hero, so getting rid of Invisigal would also just screw over Golem. But with that decision made, we moved on to the last and hardest episode of this run. This shift starts off with just 3 heroes and immediately gives us 4 calls to respond to, so it doesn't really line up good. But luckily, the call depletion time is way longer, and I'm able to respond to all the calls without failing. But after that, we reach the first roadblock of the shift. In order for me to get my heroes back on the roster, I have to save them, and in order to save Flambe, there's another stat restricted call, where I only have a 38% chance of success. I failed it on my first try. On my next attempt, I sent Punch Up and Golem on the call to increase my chances from 38 to a whopping 39% chance. So I was really out of options and I was just gonna have to brute force this. Keep in mind, it takes 6 minutes just to make it to this call, and of course, there's a cutscene I have to watch between every attempt. But after a lot of tries, I actually passed the call, which allowed me to get a pretty deep run into this shift. And then I had to choose between saving Coop or Phenomenon first. I ended up picking Coop. I didn't really have a reason to do it. There was no strategy. It was just the person I clicked on. But eventually, more of our heroes started trickling in, and our roster was back to being full. And we even got Waterboy. I mean, I don't think he's gonna be much help, but we did get Bro. But now that we had our full team, I can get into what makes this shift the most difficult by far. You see, this shift isn't like other shifts. It doesn't end after a certain amount of calls. Instead, I have to defeat Sonar before this shift will end, while still being bombarded with an insane amount of calls. I sent Coop and Punch Up on the first attack on Sonar, and they ended up being a perfect fit, but soon after, I just barely failed a call. Keep in mind, I was over 17 minutes deep into this attempt, and I was gonna have to restart the entire thing over again. This was the only moment in the run where I genuinely did not want to play this game. I knew that I was gonna have to deal with that 38% call again, and there's just so many calls this shift, it felt inevitable that I would fail one. So I had to take a brain break because I knew the next time I got back on this game, there was hours and hours of attempts ahead of me. Eventually, I was ready. I booted up the game, prepared to be sitting in my chair for like 5 more hours, listening to the same voice lines, watching the same cutscene. But then I noticed something. The cutscene I was watching was different. It was me recruiting Waterboy. It turns out there was a checkpoint. And since this checkpoint is before I failed the call, in my eyes, this is fair game not to restart the whole thing. And if you don't think so, I don't really care because it's my challenge and I mean, I was not going to sit here any longer than I had to do this. Anyway, for the next sonar attack, I opted to send Flambe and Prism, and they were a perfect fit as well. My strategy of just covering as much of the board as possible seems to be working pretty well. But then I reached yet another stat restricted call, and this one may be the worst odds we've had this entire run. A whopping 16% chance, and I failed that shit. On my next attempt, I focused on leveling up Waterboy a bit so we'd be a better fit for the call, and then I sent him and Punch up on it, and they passed it. Soon after, I hit yet another checkpoint. Really, without these, this would have absolutely sucked to do. And then it was time for another sonar attack. But this one had a stat restriction, so my plan of covering up the entire board was not going to work this time. I actually wasn't sure who to send, but I just opted to send Flambe and Prism again since they worked last time, and they worked again. On the next sonar attack, I clicked on it, and then Waterboy forced himself into the call. You see, this is why I did not want Waterboy. And I was really dumbfounded. I was at a loss for words at this point, and I just sent Phenomenon and crossed my fingers and hoped for the best. But I had to handle a few more calls before I would see the result of that shit show, and it looked like I was about to fail a call with an 85% chance of success, but then Blonde Blazer pulled up and put the odds back in my favor. But with that disaster narrowly avoided, it was time to check on the other one to see if Phenomenon and Waterboy managed to beat Sonar. And they did. I didn't think they would. I think they had like a 58% chance. If I'm right, that'd be pretty wild because this is like over a week after the gameplay I'm recording this, so that's just off the top of my head. 58 is what my gut's saying. It might have been more, it may have been less, I don't know. I just now needed to attack Sonar one more time to finish this shift, and it did not start off well. I accidentally clicked off the call, then Sonar did this giant AoE attack and damaged a bunch of my teammates. At this point, I knew I couldn't waste any more time and just sent as many people as I could to defeat Sonar, and I ended up filling up the entirety of the board. So I knew they were going to pass it. It was all just going to come down to if I could get through these last few calls. So some of you may not like the strategy I used to get through these calls. I was just sending anybody on them with no thought behind it, because I knew I wasn't going to actually have to check whether or not I passed it before Sonar would be defeated. And since I never looked at the call, how could I have failed it? I mean, that's my logic at least. I think it's fair game. Anyways, eventually it was time to check the results of the call, and they defeated Sonar. And with that, the shift was complete. I had gotten through all 8 episodes without failing a single call.